Let's begin here, because too many mistake constant thoughts of another person as proof of destiny. They believe that if he lingers in the mind, it must be fate pulling the strings. But presence in thought is not the same as presence in truth. A man can vanish from your daily life and still occupy a hidden chamber in your imagination. This is not always a sign of connection. More often, it reveals the mind's habit of clinging to what once stirred emotion. His absence does not silence the current within you, and so the memory continues to echo. Before I continue, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and if reflections like this resonate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let us turn to what this really means. You may wake in the morning ready for your day, and suddenly, his face crosses your inner vision. You may try to distract yourself with work or conversation, yet the thought slips back in. The mistake is to assume this persistence must carry a higher message. In truth, the psyche often repeats what it does not yet understand. Jung reminds us that until the unconscious becomes conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. So the real question is not whether he is thinking of you, but what part of you is calling him forth inside your own mind. The shadow may crave the familiar pattern, even if that pattern once caused pain. The persona, the mask you show to the world, may insist you are fine and untouched. But the deeper self knows otherwise. The tension between these voices is what creates the haunting presence you feel. What appears as an invisible thread pulling you toward him is often the psyche's way of saying something remains unresolved within you. It may not be him you are attached to, but the feeling you once had in his presence. That sense of being noticed, desired, chosen. The thought of him is the symbol. The real story lies underneath. Here, the setup for our reflection becomes clear. When someone lingers in the mind without contact, it is not proof of destiny. It is an invitation to examine what has been left in shadow. For the rest of this journey, we will walk step by step through that hidden territory, learning how to release what is finished and reclaim the energy for yourself. What unsettles us most is not always the presence of another person, but the way their absence exposes something fragile inside. A woman may tell herself the story is over, yet her thoughts prove otherwise. She tries to fill her days with tasks, conversations, and small distractions, only to find his image slipping back in through the cracks. This is where the fracture begins, not in the man himself, but in the collision between her will to move forward and the mind's insistence on returning to what is already past. The modern world often tells us that strong people simply let go. But the psyche does not obey quick commands. It carries within it patterns that are older, deeper, and often hidden from ordinary awareness. Carl Jung observed that what remains unresolved in the unconscious will surface again and again until it is understood. That is why the same memory, the same face, the same sensation of longing can haunt the mind long after the relationship has ended. When we look closely, the pain is not only about losing someone, it is also about losing the familiar feeling that person once represented. She remembers how it felt to be desired, how it felt to be chosen, how it felt to belong. That inner warmth becomes a memory the body craves, even when the relationship itself has brought more confusion than joy. The fracture, then, is not simply heartbreak. It is the clash between what was real and what was longed for, between the truth of what happened and the fantasy of what might have been. At this stage, the persona steps in the outer mask that wants to appear composed, unaffected, and strong. She may smile in public, keep busy at work, assure friends that she is fine. But beneath the mask, the shadow stirs. The shadow holds the unspoken truth, the anxiety that he may never return, the anger at being forgotten, the fear of being unworthy. This quiet conflict between persona and shadow deepens the wound, for it creates a split inside the self. One part tries to erase the memory, while the other clings to it with desperate strength. This is why the thoughts feel intrusive, even obsessive. They are not just about him. They are the psyche's attempt to resolve unfinished business. But instead of resolution, the mind circles in repetition. It feeds the image, hoping for closure, yet only reinforces the bond. And so the fracture becomes a cycle. The more she resists the thought, the more power it gains. The more she hides the longing, the more it whispers from the depths. The truth many overlook is that emotional repetition can feel like destiny. When a face or memory returns again and again, it creates the illusion of meaning. But not everything that repeats is fate. Sometimes it is simply habit, the unconscious returning to what it knows, even if what it knows is pain. Jung. Jung wrote that the human psyche prefers the familiar over the unknown, even if the familiar is destructive. To step beyond this requires courage, for it means entering a place where no old patterns guide the way. Consider the image of a door half open in a long hallway. The persona insists the woman move past it, telling her to look straight ahead. Yet the shadow pulls her gaze back toward the crack of light spilling out. She pauses, torn between closing the door forever and lingering at its threshold. This is the fracture, the mind trapped between movement and memory, between the call of the future and the echo of the past. What makes this wound so piercing is the confusion it creates. Is it intuition calling her to wait, or is it attachment keeping her stuck? Is it a sign that he feels the same, or is it the projection of her own longing? Without clarity, she risks mistaking attachment for destiny, shadow for soul, nostalgia for truth. This is where many remain stuck for years, circling in silent torment, unable to fully let go, yet unable to fully return. The cost of this fracture is heavy. Energy that could nourish her growth is instead poured into a ghost. Nights become restless, mornings begin with the same image, and every silence is filled with imagined conversation. Over time, the psyche begins to erode under the weight of repetition. What should have been one closed chapter continues to bleed into every new page. It is important to see that this fracture is not weakness. It is the natural outcome of unintegrated emotion. The psyche is not trying to harm her. It is trying to resolve something left incomplete. But until she is willing to look at what truly holds her, she will remain bound. The thoughts of him are the symptom. The deeper wound is the inner emptiness that has not yet found its own fullness. In this way, the first fracture is both wound and invitation. It hurts because it disrupts the image of strength she wants to project. It lingers because the unconscious has not yet been given its voice. And it matters because without addressing it, the cycle of repetition will continue dressed in different faces, yet carrying the same emptiness underneath. So we arrive here, the place where the fracture exposes its truth. The issue is not that he still lives in her mind. The issue is that she has not yet claimed the part of herself she once projected onto him. Until that claim is made, his absence will echo and his image will return. The psyche will not rest until the hidden piece of self is reclaimed. This is the threshold of transformation, for only by facing the fracture can she begin to gather the fragments of her own soul and bring them into wholeness. But for now, the tension remains a split between outer composure and inner ache, between the mask she shows and the longing she hides. This is the wound that demands attention, and it is here the deeper journey must begin. The fracture, once opened, begins to reveal its deeper pattern. Thoughts of him are not random. They are charged with energy, and that energy shapes both body and mind. Each memory carries not only an image, but also a chemistry, a pulse of longing fear or excitement that lingers long after the man himself has gone. Without realizing it, she becomes less attached to the person and more attached to the sensation he once evoked. This is where the shadow begins its work. In public, the persona insists she is fine. She goes about her tasks, holds conversations, even laughs when required. But in private, the shadow presses forward, whispering the emotions she tries to suppress. The persona is the polished mask, composed, capable, unbothered. The shadow is the hidden truth, anxious, restless, unwilling to release what once felt alive. Together, they form a tension that drains her strength. Jung described the shadow as the part of the psyche we do not wish to see in ourselves. It holds the traits we deny, the desires we cannot admit, and the fears we push aside. Yet it is not evil. It is simply unacknowledged. In this case, the shadow reveals her hidden dependency on the emotions of being wanted, even if that desire came from someone who is no longer present. The persona rejects this need, wishing to appear self-sufficient, but the shadow knows otherwise. This inner division becomes costly. The body, tuned to the chemistry of longing, begins to crave repetition. The mind, caught in its loop, returns again and again to his image, as if drawing from a well that is already dry. The more she resists, the stronger the pull becomes, because resistance itself feeds energy to the thought. This is why silence feels unbearable and distraction only temporary. The battle between mask and shadow intensifies, leaving her drained. At times, she may confuse this cycle with intuition, mistaking the persistence of thought for a sign of destiny. Yet destiny does not demand obsession. True connection feels light, while repetition feels heavy. The shadow thrives on heaviness, on replaying the past until it consumes the present. The persona denies this by performing strength. But beneath the surface, exhaustion grows. Imagine standing before a mirror in a dimly lit room. The reflection shows the composed face you wish others to see, yet behind you, a shadow stretches larger than life, demanding recognition. To ignore it only enlarges its form. This is what happens when the persona refuses to acknowledge the truth within. The mask grows thinner, the shadow grows darker, and the self becomes divided. The cost is not only emotional. Energy invested in clinging to the image of another is energy taken away from growth. Opportunities for new love, new creativity, even simple joy are dulled by the weight of what has not been released. Life feels muted, as if everything is filtered through the gray haze of repetition. The shadow feeds on what is denied, and in feeding it keeps her from living fully. Many women in this state begin to question themselves. They wonder if they are weak, foolish, or broken. Yet the truth is more subtle. They are not broken. They are caught in the universal struggle between shadow and persona. The mask demands they move on quickly, while the shadow insists on being heard. Until both are faced with honesty, the cycle continues. Jung taught that integration is the path forward. What is hidden must be brought into the light, not as shame, but as understanding. To see that the attachment is not about the man, but about the emotion he once awakened is the first step toward freedom. It is not weakness to acknowledge need, it is wisdom to name it clearly. When the shadow is given voice, it no longer has to shout through obsessive thought. But here in part 3 of our journey, the conflict remains unresolved. The persona still holds the mask. The shadow still whispers from beneath, and the self stands divided. This is the middle of the struggle, the place where many linger for years. The thoughts repeat, the longing persists, and the weight of the unresolved becomes almost normal. Yet beneath the struggle lies a hidden gift. The very tension that drains her also points the way to transformation. For every shadow hides a lesson, and every mask conceals a truth. To recognize the difference between attachment and destiny, between obsession and intuition, is the next threshold. Only then can she begin to awaken from the cycle and step toward her own wholeness. But before that awakening, she must face the mirror fully, both the polished mask and the restless shadow standing together in her own reflection. Every conflict between shadow and persona eventually reaches a breaking point. The mask grows heavier, the hidden voice grows louder, and the self can no longer carry the strain without seeking relief. In this moment, something new begins to stir, the possibility of awakening. Awakening does not arrive as a sudden burst of clarity. It comes quietly, almost invisibly, in the shift of a question. Instead of asking, "Is he thinking of me?" she begins to wonder, "How do I feel when I think of him?" This small turn of attention changes everything. For the first time, the focus moves from decoding another person's silence to listening inwardly. Jung often said that projection is one of the greatest obstacles to self-knowledge. We place onto others the feelings we cannot yet recognize as our own. The absent man becomes a canvas for her deepest longing, her hidden fears, her unclaimed worth. To withdraw that projection is not easy, but it is the beginning of freedom. What once appeared as an invisible bond to him is revealed as a mirror of her own unmet needs. This realization does not erase the feelings overnight, but it reframes them. What she thought was a thread tying her to another becomes a signal pointing back to herself. The shadow that seems so overwhelming is no longer an enemy, but a messenger. It shows her the places where she has abandoned herself, the places where she longed for validation outside instead of creating it within. In seeing this, she takes her first step toward individuation, the lifelong process of becoming whole. Individuation begins when the unconscious material, once hidden in shadow, is brought into conscious light. The longing is no longer denied. The need for connection is no longer shamed. Instead, it is seen as part of her humanity. This is the awakening, realizing that what she sought in another is a reflection of what her own soul has been asking for all along. Symbolically, it is like standing at the edge of a dark forest and realizing the shadows between the trees are not monsters, but her own reflection in dim light. The fear begins to soften. The forest remains, but now it is an inner landscape to explore rather than an enemy to resist. With this awakening comes a shift in energy. No longer is every thought of him experienced as torment. Instead, each thought becomes an invitation to ask, what part of me is this thought pointing to? What truth in myself does it echo? In that moment, the cycle that once drained her begins to lose its power. Repetition turns into reflection. Obsession turns into inquiry. This is the turning point between being haunted and being guided. The same memory that once carried her away now becomes a tool for self-discovery. She sees that what she misses may not be the man himself, but the feeling of safety, of being wanted, of being seen. And if the feeling is the true desire, then the work is not to chase another's attention, but to cultivate that sense of worth within. Awakening also brings with it the awareness of vibration. Jung wrote that we do not attract what we wish for, we attract what we are. To dwell in anxiety and longing is to radiate absence. To cultivate inner peace is to radiate presence. When she understands this, she stops trying to pull someone back into her orbit and instead begins to shift her own frequency. She realizes the work is not in controlling outcomes, but in aligning herself with the kind of love she truly wishes to live. This is not about forcing positivity or denying pain. It is about choosing clarity over confusion, presence over projection. Real intuition feels light, never desperate. Real connection feels peaceful, never frantic. The awakening is in recognizing that difference. The body learns a new rhythm, no longer addicted to the chemistry of anxiety, but beginning to settle into the calm of self-trust. At first, this change feels fragile, like a flame flickering in the wind. The old patterns still call. The shadow still whispers. The mask still tempts her to perform strength. But within, something solid is forming. Each time she turns the question inward instead of outward, she strengthens that inner ground. Each time she notices the difference between obsession and intuition, she steps closer to wholeness. The awakening is not dramatic. It is steady, subtle, and deeply personal. It feels like remembering something that was always known but long forgotten. That the self is the source of meaning, not another's gaze. In this way, the man in her mind loses his power to define her. He becomes a symbol not of destiny, but of her own unfinished story. By reading the symbol clearly, she begins to write a new chapter. This stage of the journey does not close the wound, but it opens the possibility of healing. It does not silence the shadow, but it invites the shadow into dialogue. It does not erase the persona, but it loosens its grip. The awakening is simply this: the recognition that the cycle was never about him alone. It was always about the part of herself that longed to be reclaimed. And so the path forward begins to take shape. No longer trapped in the endless loop of "does he think of me?" she begins to ask the only question that matters: how do I return to myself? This is where the light begins to enter and where transformation becomes possible. Awakening by itself is never the end. Awareness is the opening, but transformation requires a choice. The mind can recognize a pattern for years, yet until a boundary is drawn, the old cycle continues to claim its power. This is the moment where clarity must become action. She now understands that the thoughts of him were less about destiny and more about her own unresolved longing. But knowing is not enough. The choice she faces is whether to keep feeding that longing with silent repetition or to redirect the energy toward herself. This decision is not dramatic in outward appearance, but inwardly it changes everything. A boundary is not built by anger or rejection. It is built by alignment. To say I will no longer abandon myself for the memory of another is the quiet beginning of a new standard. In Jungian terms, this is the ego aligning with the deeper self, choosing wholeness over projection. The boundary is not a wall against love, but a gate that opens only to what is true. Here, the old question, "Does he think of me?" dissolves into something far more important. What am I choosing for myself today? This subtle shift ends the endless chase for signs and begins the practice of self-respect. She no longer waits to be chosen. She begins to choose. Practical steps may look small: writing letters never sent, turning to practices that ground the body, or creating space for silence without fear. But symbolically, each act is powerful. Each choice says, "My energy belongs to me first." Jung wrote that individuation requires the integration of opposites, the conscious and unconscious, the shadow and the persona. By setting a boundary, she brings these opposites together in action. She no longer hides her need in shadow or denies it in persona. She claims it openly and directs it with intention. Boundaries always bring consequences. At first, there may be discomfort, even grief. To stop feeding the image of him feels like a loss, as though releasing the last thread of connection. But in truth, this release is not loss, but liberation. The energy once trapped in longing begins to flow back into her own life. Slowly, vitality returns. Creativity awakens. Even laughter feels easier. What once felt like emptiness becomes space for something new to emerge. This transformation also changes the way she appears to others. No longer carrying the restless energy of need, she begins to radiate calm presence. Not because she is forcing it, but because she is aligned within. True magnetism arises here not from strategy, but from authenticity. People sense it without her speaking a word. Her silence carries weight. her presence speaks for itself. This is the natural result of choosing self-respect over self-abandonment. To live without boundaries is to live at the mercy of other people's presence or absence. To set a boundary is to reclaim authorship of one's own story. Jung compared this to building an inner center, a place from which life radiates, rather than a place constantly pulled outward. The transformation, then, is not about rejecting love. It is about creating the conditions where only real love can enter. We must also understand boundaries are not only about what she will not accept, they are about what she now welcomes. She begins to imagine relationships that feel safe, respectful, and nourishing. Instead of replaying the past, she practices living in the vibration of what she truly desires. The body, once addicted to the chemistry of anxiety, learns the chemistry of peace. This is how new patterns form, not through force, but through repeated choice. The image of him may still appear at times, but the power has shifted. Before, the thought drained her. Now, it reminds her of the boundary she has drawn. Each return of his image becomes an opportunity to reaffirm her decision. I no longer feed this cycle. I choose myself. Over time, the repetition loses its grip, not by being fought, but by being redirected. Transformation always carries a risk, the risk of standing alone. Many hesitate at this threshold, fearing that letting go means emptiness. Yet the truth is the opposite. By honoring herself first, she clears the way for connections that truly match her depth. If the man from her past is meant to align, he will do so by rising to her new frequency. If not, she has already created space for another. This is the power of individuation in practice. To draw a boundary is to declare, I will not live divided. I will not chase what denies me peace. I will not confuse longing with love. Each of these choices shapes the psyche into greater wholeness. Each of them strengthens the self. The transformation is not about perfection. It is not about never thinking of him again. It is about no longer abandoning the self in those thoughts. The difference is profound. In the past, his absence defined her mood. Now, her own choices define her presence. This is how the shadow loses its control. This is how the persona relaxes its mask. This is how the self steps forward as one. When a woman chooses herself in this way, something shifts in the universe around her. Relationships that once drained her begin to fade. Situations that once confused her lose their hold. New connections, aligned with her new standard, begin to appear naturally. It is as if the outer world reshapes itself to match the inner boundary. And in truth, it does. Jung would say, you do not attract what you want. You attract what you are. By becoming whole, she attracts wholeness. This is the essence of transformation. Not in chasing signs or waiting for someone else's decision, but in setting a clear boundary that says, I choose myself. I choose peace. I choose real love. And from this point forward, every thought, every choice, every action begins to flow from that center. When a cycle has been faced, when the shadow is acknowledged and the mask is set down, the mind becomes quiet in a new way. The man who once lingered in thought no longer holds the same weight. His image may appear from time to time, but it no longer defines her mood or steals her energy. Instead, it reminds her of the journey she has taken from projection to awakening, from longing to self-respect. The lesson is simple but profound. It was never only about him. It was about the part of her that longed to be seen, the part that she had forgotten to claim for herself. What she sought outside was always a reflection of what her own soul was waiting to provide. Once this truth is seen clearly, the old grip begins to loosen. She no longer waits for signs. She no longer asks if he is thinking of her. She no longer loses herself in repetition. Carl Jung often wrote that the work of individuation is to reclaim what has been lost in shadow and to integrate it into the whole self. Here, the shadow revealed its lesson. The longing she once projected outward became the mirror that led her inward. What was once a cycle of obsession is now a guide toward her own depth. This is how wounds become wisdom. The boundary she drew was not only against another, but for herself. It was the quiet choice to say, I will no longer abandon myself for a memory. I will live from my own center. That choice is the turning point. From it comes the freedom to welcome love when it appears, but not to depend on it for survival. From it comes the ability to grieve what has ended without confusing grief for destiny. In this way, she becomes magnetic without trying. Others may sense the shift in her presence. She no longer moves with the restless energy of need, but with the calm of self-trust. Mystery returns not as a strategy, but as a natural byproduct of authenticity. The kind of love that approaches her now will be different because it must align with the standard she has set. What no longer resonates will simply fall away. There is deep peace in knowing that what is meant will remain and what is not will release itself. True love does not demand that you betray your own soul. True love does not thrive in confusion or silence. It thrives in clarity, presence, and devotion. And the most important devotion begins with the self. So the story closes not with waiting for another's decision, but with a return to the inner ground. She now understands that longing is not proof of destiny, that obsession is not intuition, and that silence from another is not a sign to abandon herself. She has learned that choosing herself first is not selfish. It is the very condition for love to be real. Symbolically, this is the moment when the mirror no longer deceives. She looks into her reflection and sees both the persona and the shadow no longer at war, but standing together. The mask no longer hides the shadow, no longer whispers. Both are integrated. Both are accepted. This is wholeness, not perfection, but the steady presence of a self that no longer splits against itself. Jung reminds us that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. That is the deeper meaning of this journey. The man who once haunted her thoughts was only a symbol pointing to what had been left behind within. By following the symbol inward, she has arrived at her own truth. And now, her path is clear. For you listening now, the same reflection applies. Whenever a face lingers in your thoughts, ask not only what it means about them, but what it reveals about you. Ask what part of your soul is waiting to be reclaimed. Ask what boundary is calling to be set. What energy is asking to be redirected? What new beginning is quietly waiting to emerge? In the end, the story is never only about another. It is about the relationship you hold with yourself. When you honor that relationship, everything else falls into place. The people who cannot walk with you will drift away. The connections that are true will grow stronger. And above all, your own presence will become a source of peace that no absence can take away. This is the closure, not in forgetting, but in remembering yourself, not in forcing the universe, but in aligning with what is real, not in waiting to be chosen, but in choosing yourself first. For when you do, life responds in kind. So let this reflection rest with you tonight. Notice how it feels to turn inward rather than outward. Notice how light it feels to no longer carry the weight of chasing signs. And notice how quiet strength grows when you honor yourself before all else. Thank you for listening and walking through these reflections with me. Before you go, I invite you to share in the comments what part of this journey spoke to you most. Your words may help another who is walking the same path.